If you map out every bank branch that has closed in regional Australia over the last 8 years, the pattern looks almost intentional. One by one, the dots just vanish. We're talking about 596 towns that once had a major bank and now have nothing. Since 2017 alone, a third of all regional branches have simply disappeared. But it's not just the banks. Try layering other losses on top of that map. Add the towns that lost their local GP. Then add the ones where the hospitals stopped performing surgery. Finally, include the schools that lost their second teacher because the student numbers dropped too low. The story is always the same. It's the same towns and the same inland corridors. It is a slow, steady retreat from the parts of Australia furthest from the coast. The strange thing is that Australia's population is actually exploding. We are growing faster than almost any other developed nation. But that growth isn't being shared. Instead, it's being poured into a few specific postcodes on the edges of Sydney and Melbourne, while entire regions are left to hollow out. No one calls this an official policy. But when you see the same thing happening in 596 towns in every state for over 30 years, you have to ask, is this just neglect? Or is it actually the plan? For most of Australia's modern history, the government didn't just let country towns happen. It actually created them. There was a deep-seated belief that settling families on small farms across the inland was both economically smart and morally right. This belief even had a name. It was called the yeoman ideal. The logic behind this was that Australia's true character wasn't found in its cities, but on its land. Because of that, the men and women working that land deserved the full support of the state. So schools, hospitals, and rail lines weren't just perks or afterthoughts. They were the terms of an unspoken contract. The government asked people to live in the most remote corners of the continent, and in exchange, it provided the foundation they needed to survive. This contract eventually became an official promise to the nation's heroes. That contract was made explicit after World War I. In 1916, the Returned Soldiers Settlement Act offered returning soldiers something tangible in exchange for their service on the battlefield, and that gift was land. Over 40,000 veterans took up the offer. Almost overnight, new communities cropped up everywhere, from the wheat belts of the west to the river gum forests along the Murray. The promise was direct: a land fit for heroes, prosperous farms, stable families, thriving towns. It didn't always work out, though. By 1929, nearly 1 in 4 soldier settlers in New South Wales had walked off their blocks. The soil was poor, the holdings too small, and the capital too thin. But the ambition didn't die. After World War II, the government tried again. The scheme was expanded with the lessons of the first attempt built in. They carved out hundreds of dairy farms. In Victoria's Murray Valley alone, more than 500 irrigated dairy farms were carved out of dry land. They also built entire towns from scratch, such as Pandana on Kangaroo Island and Padthaway in South Australia. The Snowy Mountains scheme became the ultimate symbol of this era. It employed over 100,000 workers from more than 30 countries between 1949 and 1974. It proved that building infrastructure in the bush wasn't charity, it was nation building. There was an entire political system designed to make this work. Behind all these projects was the Country Party, which is now called the Nationals. Its job was to make sure regional Australia stayed on the map. Because of them, government services stayed in small towns, even if they didn't make a profit. These services were the anchors of the community. Marketing boards for wheat, dairy and wool kept farm income steady, which kept money flowing through local shops. Think about a Telstra office in a town of 800 people. It wasn't just a phone service. It was a steady salary for a local family who then spent that money at the general store. Everything was connected. The government treated these towns as vital parts of a national map that it had a duty to maintain. Eventually, this era reached a turning point. The peak of this movement arrived in 1973. The Whitlam government went all in. It established the Department of Urban and Regional Development and began funding growth centres like Albury Wodonga and Bathurst Orange. For a brief moment, decentralisation wasn't just rhetoric. It was funded, planned and legislated. Then the tide turned, Whitlam fell, and the governments that followed began to cut the programs. The political will to invest deeply in the region started to fade, and it never truly came back. But the real decline didn't happen because of a single budget cut or one specific leader. It started with a new economic idea, a quiet shift in logic that would rewrite the rules for every job, school, and clinic in rural Australia. At the time, almost nobody saw it coming. In 1995, every government in Australia signed on to a new way of doing business called the National Competition Policy. This was the beginning of a cause and effect chain that became the machinery of withdrawal. The policy came from a 1993 review led by Professor Fred Hilmer, and its goal was straightforward: make the economy more efficient. To do that, the government opened up its services to competition and stripped away the rules that protected local industries. They reviewed 1,800 different laws and changed about 85% of them. Suddenly, things like electricity, rail, water and mail were restructured, corporatised or privatised entirely. The marketing boards that had kept farm income steady for decades were dismantled. When the dairy industry was deregulated in 2000, the impact was immediate. Incomes collapsed, and the communities that relied on dairy were suddenly left out in the cold. The Productivity Commission later argued that these reforms were a success. They pointed out that electricity prices fell and the national economy grew. But these benefits didn't land in the same place as the costs. When Telstra cut its workforce by nearly 20,000 people in the late 90s, those losses hit regional towns much harder than the decision-makers in Canberra expected. In a town like Narrandera, in the Riverina, 70 Telstra jobs vanished. That is a devastating blow for a small community where one employer represents a huge chunk of the local economy. The same pattern played out across rail depots, grain handling facilities, and government offices in hundreds of towns. Each closure made economic sense on a spreadsheet, but the spreadsheet never measured what happened to the town once the jobs were gone. While services were being pulled away from above, the way we farm was changing from below. Since the late 70s, the number of farms has been falling while the size of the remaining farms has grown by 30%. And even though there are fewer farmers today, they are producing a crop worth $26 billion, nearly 8 times more than before. The economics are brutal and simple. Machines are replacing people. Large farms are swallowing small ones. Today, one family works the land that used to support 4. That means fewer kids in the school, fewer customers at the shop, and fewer reasons for anyone to stay. Corporate investment has only moved things faster. Across New South Wales and Queensland, big companies and private investors have spent tens of millions of dollars buying up massive stretches of land. Lawson Grain spent tens of millions consolidating properties, and Gina Reinhardt expanded her holdings across the Darling Downs. At the same time, the families who are still farming are facing a crisis of who will take over. A Dairy Australia review of Western Victorian ranches found that only 14% of dairy farmers actually have a plan to hand the farm to the next generation. With land values doubling in just a decade, selling to a big corporation looks like a better exit strategy every year. And every time a family sells up, the town loses another household. This is where the spiral really starts to tighten. When the population drops, the bank closes. 596 Australian towns that once had a major bank branch now have none. More than a third of all regional branches have shut since 2017. Once the bank is gone, people have to drive to the next town to do their banking. While they are there, they buy their groceries. The local shop loses its customers and eventually shuts down. Healthcare follows the same pattern. Research published in the Australian Journal of Rural Health found that small rural towns have far fewer doctors and nurses than the cities, and specialists are even harder to find. The AMA's 2025 survey confirmed that 90% of rural doctors rank inadequate funding and staffing as the most critical issue. And they've said the same thing in every survey since 2016. When a local hospital stops delivering babies, young families move away. When the school loses students, it loses a teacher. It is a chain reaction. Each withdrawal triggers the next, and once that cycle starts, it is almost impossible to stop. Australia has never actually had a formal policy to let its small towns die. No Prime Minister has ever stood at a lectern and announced that certain communities were being abandoned. There is no secret document titled "The Towns We've Decided to Let Go." Yet if you look at every decision made over the last 30 years, every service closure and every budget cut, the result looks exactly like a plan. The country has achieved the outcome of a deliberate strategy without ever having to admit it had one. Researchers who examined strategic planning frameworks across Victoria and South Australia found exactly this contradiction at work. Every policy document they reviewed acknowledged that rural populations were ageing and declining. Every one of them recognised the growing spatial imbalance between the capital cities and the interior, and not a single one offered a policy framework for managing that decline. The focus, universally, was on growth. It was growth for the cities, growth for the suburbs, and growth for the coast where the votes are. The dying towns were mentioned as a statistic, but they were never treated as a responsibility. This is what makes the story so hard to face. There isn't a single villain to blame. There isn't one bad decision we can just reverse. Instead, we are looking at a system that was redesigned over decades to treat every public service as a business. If a service doesn't make a profit, it doesn't survive. But these towns were originally built on the opposite idea. They were created because the government believed the nation needed people in the interior. They committed the resources to keep them there. Today, that commitment has been quietly withdrawn. It has been replaced by a logic where a post office for 600 people or a hospital ward that only handles 40 births a year simply cannot survive a cost-benefit analysis. The math is perfect, but the outcome is devastating, and it reaches further than the towns themselves. Australia is now one of the most urbanised nations on Earth. Only about 13% of the population lives in rural areas, and that number is falling every year. Nearly 80% of the national growth is happening in the capital cities. We are building a narrow, crowded corridor along the coast, while the middle of the country empties out. When a town of 1,000 people loses its only doctor, it is a local tragedy. But when that same thing happens in hundreds of towns for 30 years, it becomes something else. It is a national choice that was never put to a vote. There is a main street in Western New South Wales, though it could be any of a dozen towns, where a war memorial still stands in the centre of the road. The names on that stone belong to men who were promised that their sacrifice would buy a future for places just like this. Today, the pub is still open and a few cars are parked at the curb. The post office is only open 3 days a week. From a distance, it looks like the town is just quiet. But quiet is not the same thing as stable. Stillness is not the same thing as peace. What you are seeing is the end of a process that took 30 years to finish. It was a process where no one was held accountable and no one was asked for their opinion. No one specifically decided to kill these towns, but no one decided to save them either. In a country run by policy, that silence is the final decision.